Oh, it's time. It's time. It's Mr. Ballen time.
Yeah. Mr. B. Allen. No.
Mr. John B. Allen.
John B. Allen.
Dropped a video yesterday. And I think it may be about some aliens. Your favorite. We've been watching a lot of cryptid Mr. Ballen.
I'm fine with cryptids. I'm not fine with aliens.
So aliens, Bigfoots. We need to find
cryptids and aliens.
We need to find a Mothman.
Totally different things. Yeah.
Mr. Ballen video, so you can learn about the Mothman.
People in the comments, actually, on the last Mr. Ballen video, I think it was the Mr. Ballen video, were like, Nikki, I said, is Mothman worth watching? And you're like, Nikki, that's like over 30 years old. Why are you asking people? And they said, not worth it.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that you guys let me know. Not worth my time.
Yeah.
I need to do that more.
Yeah.
Anyway,
the title of this video is It Started as a Sighting and Ended in Horror.
Horror.
Ended in horror.
Horror.
So...
Okay. I'm skeptical. We'll see. I don't know.
Are you going to be a grumpus?
I just feel like...
Don't be a grumbly bump.
Just if it is aliens, that's just... I don't know. I believe in aliens. I think that they're true. I think that the stories are terrifying. But also, I don't want to think about it.
Well, let's think about it. You ready?
Yeah, I guess.
Today's story is about a disturbing discovery made in Brazil in the 1980s. Now, at the time, the Brazilian government attempted to hide this story, saying it was...
Are you watching the
Yeah, I was
video?
just trying to see if it was too loud.
Okay.
Today's story is about a disturbing discovery made in Brazil in the 1980s. Now, at the time, the Brazilian government attempted to hide this story, saying it was just too sensitive for the public to know about it. But eventually, photos of this discovery were leaked.
What?
And it sent Brazil into a panic. Now, I'm not going to show you any of the actual leaked photographs because they're just too graphic, but I will be describing them in some detail towards the end of this video. So, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a can of soda, but be sure you secretly, violently shake it before you hand it over. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
I feel like it's been a while since I've seen the intro.
Yeah?
Yeah.
On the afternoon of September 29th, 1988, a 10-year-old boy named Francisco was walking along the perimeter of a man-made lake in southern Brazil while poking the ground with his stick. Francisco was doing one of his favorite after-school activities, which was looking for bugs. And this lake, which was a part of the Billings Reservoir in the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo, was his favorite place to do that. And the reservoir was gigantic, but it was not shaped like a typical circular lake. Instead, it was more like a big river that kind of wound around and had all these skinny branches kind of jutting off the sides of it. And on this particular day, Francisco was walking along one of those skinny offshoots of this lake, where at certain points, if Francisco wanted to, he could literally swim to the other side of the lake in a matter of minutes. Now, Francisco knew he was not really supposed to be anywhere near this reservoir, because in recent years, gangs from the nearby cities would bring their murder victims out to this reservoir and bury them here. And so locals knew it was not a safe place and to stay clear.
I'm not going to Google it.
Francisco, he didn't listen to any of that because he loved walking around this lake and looking for bugs. And so he thought, you know what? No one's harmed me yet, so what's the big deal? And so, as Francisco casually walked along, poking at the mud, looking for his bugs, he finally saw one. It was a huge water scorpion, almost 2 inches long. And so immediately, Francisco, without taking his eyes off the bug, drops his backpack, grabs a clear container that he kept in the side pocket. He opened it up, he bent down, and he scooped up this water scorpion and capped it. And then he brought the container up and looked inside to kind of admire his new pet. And as he was staring at this container, he noticed something odd on the other side of the lake. He basically saw it through the plastic container. And so he lowered the container to get a better look at this strange thing on the other side of the water. And what he saw was this big group of vultures, all kind of standing in a circle right on the water's edge. And immediately, Francisco was way more interested in these vultures than in this bug, because vultures meant there had to be a dead thing nearby, because vultures are scavengers.
Gotta go check that
whatever
out.
they were circled around was probably a dead animal. But Francisco, he looked around and realized there was no way to get to the other side of the water to see whatever this dead thing was unless he swam. And he knew if he went back home with soaking wet clothes, his mom would know
he took
he
all
had
his
snuck
clothes
to the
off, and
reservoir
then, oh my
he'd be in
God.
trouble. And so, feeling really frustrated, Francisco just picked up a rock and chucked it to the other side, trying to splash the water near the vultures to get them to fly away so he could see the dead thing. But the first rock he threw did not really have an effect. The vultures just kind of turned around and looked at him and then went back to whatever was on the ground. And so Francisco gathered a big pile of like 25 rocks and began throwing them one after the other at these vultures. And finally, Francisco had caused enough chaos on the other side of the water that the vultures got upset and they took to the air and they flew away. And finally, Francisco got a clear view of the dead thing that was in the middle of the circle of vultures. Now, initially, Francisco thought this dead thing was going to be maybe a bird or some other small animal from the area, but when he got a good look at this dead thing from 30 feet away, it didn't look like either of those things. It didn't have fur, it didn't have feathers, it actually looked kind of pale, almost like a pig. But Francisco's thinking to himself, why would a pig be all the way
go
here?
home
And
before
then
you get
it slowly
PTSD.
dawned on Francisco that what he was looking at was actually a dead person. Suddenly terrified, Francisco scooped up his things, turned around, and ran to the nearest village where he began screaming for help. Within a few hours, the area along the water where the vultures had been and where this body was swarming with police and also with curious villagers. Normally, when a body was discovered in or near this reservoir, which unfortunately happened quite a bit because of all the recent gang violence, police would often break ranks from the investigation and walk over to the local onlookers and kind of fill them in and tell them, who this person was and what they think happened. But this time, it was totally different. The police were totally secretive, and it was really obvious. The police immediately roped off the entire area with crime scene tape, and then the police officers stood in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, blocking the view of the villagers so they couldn't see the body. And then when villagers actually walked up to police and said, hey, can you tell us what's going on? The police would say they couldn't talk about it, and then they would tell the villagers to back up and stay away. Locals would stick around for a while, being treated this way the entire time by police, and then finally when the sun started to go down and it was clear the police were very committed to hiding what was going on, whoever was still there finally just left, figuring when they got home they could just turn on the news and see what had happened with this dead person. But when they got home and turned on their TV, there was not one news story about this body. And at a minimum, this story should have dominated local news, but it somehow was not being talked about.
Act like
and then
nothing
even
happened.
stranger was the next morning when locals got up, they headed back to the reservoir to see what the police were up to. And when they got there, they found the police were gone, the body was gone, and there was absolutely no trace that anyone or anything had ever been there. It was like it had been totally sanitized. For days, locals in this area continued to check the TV news, they checked the radio, the newspapers for some story, some bit of information about this dead body that was found. But again, there was just absolutely nothing, and it just made no sense. Why wasn't anyone talking about this? And so eventually, in the absence of any official information about what happened, a rumor began to circulate among locals that the body belonged to a local fisherman who had gone missing 3 days before Francisco discovered him. And this fisherman, apparently he was an alcoholic, and he had gone to the reservoir, and he had begun drinking, and apparently he drank so much that it killed him. Now, many people wondered, if this drunk fisherman story was the real story, then why were the police so secretive about the body, and why weren't they willing to give up any information to the crowd about what had happened to this guy? I mean, a drunk fisherman is not a super sensitive thing.
Right.
It just seemed like that doesn't line up with the police's behavior. But questions like these remained unanswered, and after several weeks of still no new information, no news coverage anywhere, even the most skeptical of villagers who really thought there's something weird going on here, they just kind of forgot about it and moved on. Until 6 years later, in 1994, when someone, we don't know who, from the Brazilian government decided they just couldn't keep the secret any longer. And so they gathered up some photos and an autopsy report they were not supposed to have, and they smuggled those things to the media. And once the media published these things, it became immediately clear that the dead man who was found in the reservoir in 1988 was not a drunk fisherman who drank himself to death, nor was he the victim of gang violence. Instead, it appeared that this person's death could potentially be paranormal. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you gotta listen to the brand new Ballen Studios podcast called Bedtime Stories. For the uninitiated, Bedtime Stories has been a long-standing, incredible YouTube channel that puts out just some of the best dark, scary storytelling on the internet, and now they're making this brand new podcast in collaboration with our studio. So if you want some more incredible storytelling to add to your weekly roster of content, go to any podcast platform anywhere and search for Ballen Studios and click on Bedtime Stories. They put out new episodes every single Wednesday. Here's a clip from this week's episode called Without a Trace.
The northwestern state of Alaska remains one of America's most unsettled and unexplored regions. It is a place of wonder and mystery, but also of great danger, with roughly 2,500 people going missing there every year. And one settlement, situated far to the west of the state, remains the setting for some of the most bizarre of these disappearances.
I was getting ready to say, I can't do two. I got too much attention deficit issues to focus on two stories at one time.
But before we dive into the significance of those leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report, you need to understand a weird aspect of Brazil's history. Brazil has an absolutely astounding number of sightings of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs for short. And these are not your typical UFO stories where some person claims they saw aliens or they were abducted by aliens, but they have no witnesses, they have no proof, they have nothing but their own story. No, in Brazil, the bulk of their UFO sightings are reported by their military, because Brazil actually has a government program to monitor UFO sightings because it happens so much in their country. In fact, the Brazilian government was directly involved in one of the most famous UFO sightings of all time. It was called the Night of the UFOs. This famous sighting, or sightings, because it actually happened in 4 different Brazilian states simultaneously, happened on May 19th, 1986, which was 2 years before Francisco spotted the dead body in the reservoir. On that 1986 day, at around 8:15 p.m., an air traffic controller at an international airport in Sao Paulo noticed 3 red lights hovering over the airport, and so the controller called it in and asked, what are these things? But nobody knew. And at the exact same time, all across Brazil, dozens and dozens of other people who have no idea what's happening at this international airport began reporting that they too were seeing strange lights in the sky. And many of these reports of these lights were coming from military personnel and government officials. And so this was like a really big deal that all across Brazil, everybody's seeing lights in the sky. And so the government, in response to this, scrambled their fighter jets and sent the jets up to try to intercept one of these sets of lights, just to see who or what they were and potentially shoot them down if they had to. But when these jets got anywhere close to these unidentified flying objects, these lights in the sky, these UFOs would move away instantly. One UFO was observed suddenly disappearing and then reappearing 20 miles away in just 5 seconds, which meant that UFO had to travel at least 5 times the speed of sound to cover that distance in such a short amount of time. For reference, humans are not capable of going that fast. We cannot do that. Eventually, the night of the UFOs ended when all these UFOs, these lights in the sky, just kind of suddenly vanished. And then a couple of days later, the Brazilian government held this big press conference about the event, and they would say, we have no idea what those lights were or where they came from. We have no clue. However, whoever or whatever was controlling these UFOs showed obvious signs of intelligence. Now, as mind-blowing as that would be to hear that potentially intelligent creatures are flying around your airspace, remember, this is Brazil, where UFO sightings were kind of the norm, and so people were definitely shocked by this. This was a terrifying thing.
No shit.
But they just kind of accepted what they were told and assumed, the government will handle this, and people moved on with their lives. That is, until several years later, in 1994, when those photos and the autopsy report of the dead person in the reservoir were leaked, and then suddenly the people of Brazil, they're seeing this stuff and they're realizing, wait a minute, the night of the UFOs may not have been an isolated instance. Those UFOs may never have left. Here is what the public learned from the leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report. Back in 1988, when little Francisco spotted the dead body from the other side of the water, he correctly identified that it was a man's body. But Francisco had been wrong when he told authorities that it didn't look like this guy had any visible injuries on him. And the guy was naked, and so Francisco felt pretty confident that he would have seen something if the guy was wounded. But when the police arrived and they saw the body up close, they immediately saw he had several very serious and very strange physical injuries. He had these 4 perfectly circular 1 to 1.5 inch diameter holes
Maybe just on one
drilled
side.
into his body. There were 2 right above his chest, basically sitting above his armpit. There was one that was right over his belly button, so his belly button was gone. It was just a hole where it had been. And there was also one in his crotch. And these holes were not crudely done. These were done with surgical precision, almost like whoever had done it was using high-end medical tools to make these cuts. Now, at first glance, the authorities had no idea why these holes were on this guy's body. But when the autopsy was done, they discovered this man was missing the majority of his internal organs, and after doing some investigating, they discovered that all of his organs had literally been vacuumed out of him through these holes on his body. Those holes were basically just ports to pull things out of him. Also, most of the man's blood had been suctioned out of those holes as well. But that wasn't all. The man also had one of his ears removed, one of his eyes was removed, and the lower part of his face was also removed. And again, all of these cuts looked like they had been made with absolute surgical precision. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of all the things that came to light when these documents were leaked was something that, unless you looked really closely at the autopsy report, you wouldn't necessarily notice. And it had to do with this man's vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve is something that controls part of your nervous system that's responsible for automatic functions like heart rate and digestion. And so when your body is suddenly in great distress, like suddenly you're fighting for your life or something, your vagus nerve can basically shut off those automatic functions like digestion in order to ensure all your energy is going towards fighting for your life. But in this dead man's case, his autopsy revealed that his vagus nerve had gone absolutely wild right at the moment of his death. It's complicated, but this suggests that this man was very likely alive when his face was being surgically cut off, and those holes were being drilled into his body, and his organs were being vacuumed out. And then at some point, the excruciating pain that came from these horrible things happening to him got so bad, his vagus nerve basically turned off his heart. So it was not these horrible physical injuries that killed him. He literally died from the pain of these physical injuries. In short, his body basically killed itself to avoid feeling the pain it was feeling. So I'm sure you're wondering, how does the dead man in the reservoir and these leaked photos and the autopsy report, how does all of that connect with the night of the UFOs, which happened 2 years before the man in the reservoir was even found? Well, following the night of the UFOs in 1986, farmers in Brazil who lived in the areas where these famous sightings took place began reporting that their cattle were dying kind of inexplicably. And this began happening with enough frequency in all of these areas where the UFO sightings had taken place that a theory began to develop in Brazil that maybe the UFOs that were here during the night of the UFOs have something to do with all these cows turning up dead. And as that theory began to take hold all across Brazil, that, UFOs are killing our cattle, another theory began to come out of that one, which was, well, if the UFOs are coming in here and killing cattle, what's stopping them from killing people? Yeah. And then in 1988, so 2 years after the night of the UFOs, and right in the middle of all these farmers all across Brazil saying their cows were dying for no reason, the dead man in the reservoir was discovered. And as soon as the government saw the physical condition this guy was in, with the weird holes drilled in his body and his organs missing and his face pulled off, that, plus the fact that he was located in this reservoir, which, by the way, was in a night of the UFO sighting area, the government decided they would have to hide the story. A critical detail that I have left out intentionally until right now is that the cattle who were turning up dead, they were turning up dead with circular holes drilled into their bodies, with organs missing and parts of their faces removed. Meaning, clearly, whatever was happening to these cattle inside of these sighting areas had happened to this man in the reservoir. And if that got out to the public, then it would confirm for many people in Brazil that, yep, the UFOs, they're the ones going after the cattle, and now they're going after us too. And so this was why the police were so secretive about the body and not letting anybody see it or learn anything about it. And it was also why no news was run anywhere in Brazil about the story. It's because the government was really trying to make sure it did not get out. And the government was able to keep it quiet until 1994, when those photos and the autopsy report were leaked. But like all things having to do with UFOs or aliens or paranormal stuff, it's like despite the evidence, those things very quickly are pushed into the kind of conspiracy theory bucket, and they stay there. People do not want to touch that category. So, even though Brazil remains an absolute hotbed for UFO sightings, Wikipedia even has a page dedicated just to tracking Brazilian UFO sightings. Despite all that, no one really cares. But if you care, there is an unbelievable amount of information online about what's going on in Brazil, and if nothing else, it is just a fascinating rabbit hole to fall into.
1.
Well,
this is why I don't like to learn shit about aliens. 2. I thought of something. Why did they return him?
I mean,
if they're so advanced and they have all these vacuums that can suck out all your organs and blood and all this crazy shit, why drop him back off? Why not just liquidize his body and shoot it out into space or whatever the fuck they do?
You have the capability to set a banana peel on fire, do you? Or you just throw it away? Do you care if the ants find out where it's at? Who cares? Who cares? Why should they care? They don't care. If they exist. I mean, and also taking into account that aliens could be anything from anywhere outside of here, would their brains even move in that direction of considering concealing something like that?
True.
I mean, obviously, they had no regard for the victim's feelings.
A lot. You know what I'm so curious about? They talk about, it's a coroner, right? The person. How can they tell that? How would they know?
It's a science,
That's
There's a science to it, and knowing how long and how things happened and what caused death and stuff like that.
Interesting and wild that they could know something like that. It would be different, this guy's got massively clogged arteries and had a heart attack.
But to know that the vagus nerve shut off his heart, I mean, I guess it would just be the condition of things. and obviously there's a science to it.
Oh,
But
I just think that's crazy.
you know what I was thinking the entire time, where he's thinking this circular thing that was like sucking out all the organs and everything. You know what I was thinking about? Those little nose vacuum cleaners that suck out the stuff in your pores and shit. I was like, these aliens just.
I probably shouldn't have done that.
Yeah. But I didn't. This was weird, grotesque, and fucked up, but I still think that it could have very easily been like the fucking gangs.
I mean, what, the fucking shop vac they're sucking everything out with? Like,
Who
what?
knows?
I don't know.
Who knows?
I do think it's interesting that it's the same area where they're like, hey, don't go here because you're gonna see a dead body one day, and then he sees a dead body.
Yeah.
And then, so, like, I don't know. Like, why would it be there? Like,
yeah, the way that the police handled it,
weird.
in contrast to, they say that this happens all the time here because of the crime. So it's like there's that. It would have been more convincing if it would have been like this guy disappeared on the night of the UFOs, but then several years later was found dead right there that way.
Yeah.
That would have made it more like, oh fuck.
Like there's no possible
I just
way.
feel like the connection.
Yeah.
I feel like
Also, why are there so many sightings in Brazil? Like, what's that about?
there's a lot of countries where the government and the population will just be like, yeah, we saw
So
aliens.
instead of just being like, no, it didn't happen.
America is a country that is peculiar in the way that we react to that phenomenon. It's not like in Japan, they don't view it the same way that we do.
Then
In
there's
India,
a lot of sightings there too.
well, they're just like
This
aliens.
happened.
India, aliens. You know, Brazil, must be aliens. We don't fucking know. You know, but to us, it's like, no, that can't be. I refuse to believe in we control everything. We know everything. It's not. There's no greater thing unless it's God, the Christian,
our
the
government.
Judeo-Christian explanation to everything.
I mean,
You know,
sadly,
unless it's that,
that makes sense.
anything other supernatural cannot. You're crazy. You're stupid. You're mad. You're crazy if you believe in anything outside of baby Jesus. You know,
Little baby Jesus.
and it's really weird. Like if you look at cultures from around the world, they're all the time talking about God, talking about angels, talking about demons within the context of something really wild
Oh yeah.
that we don't know what the fuck it is. And they assign these names of deities and shit to things, but they're not like, if it's not in our book, then it doesn't exist and it has to play by these rules. And if we see it or somebody says they saw something else, we're just going to completely deny that. In other cultures and in other societies, they see the supernatural and phenomenons and UFOs and things like that. And that's where their angels and demons and things come from. And they assign to that. You know, they could see a shooting star and just be like, oh, it's an angel. AKA, I don't know what the fuck that was, but it's miraculous.
Yeah.
Us, we're like, no, an angel's name is Michael, and he is this, and he does this, and has a whole backstory, and anything that deviates from that is bullshit.
It's like 72 eyeballs.
It's so crazy to me. It's so wild to me, the way that is.
This little alien.
It's like people who profess to be the most humble are like, anything that we don't have the exact definition to and know everything about is not real. Crazy. But I don't know if I'm convinced by this story. I think that some organized crime group could have just fucked this guy up something tremendously bad. I'm just not convinced. Like, had somebody been like, I saw this light from the sky and it went down and then it disappeared and then here this guy was.
Yeah.
You know, not just like this kid found a dead body and the police acted weird about it.
Yeah.
That to me sounds like probably some organized crime shit. But I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm interested to know what you guys think. Sushi wants to know what you guys think. He's climbing. I told you needed to
trim
his nails.
I don't know where his thing is.
Come here, bud.
Gosh.
But anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this reaction. And thanks for hanging out with us. We will see you in the next one.
See you guys.
Bye.